Elliot Drummond sat alone in his lab, surrounded by monitors displaying endless streams of data. The hum of machines was the only sound in the sterile environment. A quiet man by nature, Elliot found solace in the predictability of his work, the precision of his calculations. Sound, to him, was more than a medium of communication. It was a force, a vibration, a pulse that held the universe together. He often joked to himself that in a galaxy of chaos, sound was the one thing that never betrayed him. But today was different. Today, as he analyzed the data from his latest experiment, something felt off. The numbers didn't add up. The frequencies didn't match. He leaned closer to his workstation, scanning the encrypted signals from the Galactic Council's latest transmission. His brow furrowed as he realized that the transmission wasn't just encrypted, it was manipulated. Elliot ran a quick diagnostic check. The frequencies were wrong, too precise, too controlled. Someone had been altering them. At first, he assumed it was a flaw in the transmission system, but the more he investigated, the more convinced he became that the Council, for whom he had been developing sound-based technology, was using this technology for something far more sinister. The Council, a coalition of the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy, was supposed to be a neutral body, regulating peace, resolving conflicts, and overseeing communications between planets. But Elliot's discovery suggested something far darker. He dove deeper into the data, tracing the signal's origin back to a central node in the Council's command hub. There it was, a pattern emerging that could only mean one thing: they were using sound to manipulate thoughts, to control the very minds of entire species. His fingers trembled as he processed the implications. The Council wasn't just using sound to transmit messages, they were altering those messages. They were using sound frequencies to subtly influence emotions, behavior, even political decisions. Entire civilizations were being bent to their will, and no one knew. He could hear his breath quickening as the magnitude of the revelation hit him. He had been working for them, unknowingly aiding in the suppression of free will across the galaxy. Elliot had always known that the Council had a certain level of influence. But this was beyond anything he had ever imagined. His mind raced as he thought through the ramifications. If the Council could manipulate the sound frequencies of entire populations, it would be impossible to resist them. There would be no rebellion, no pushback. Resistance would be futile. They had already won. But Elliot wasn't just any engineer. He wasn't some faceless cog in the machine of the galaxy's grand scheme. He was a creator, a visionary. And if the Council could use sound to control, then surely, sound could be used to break their grip. The thought hit him like a lightning bolt. What if he could create a frequency, a signal, that could disrupt the Council's manipulation? A signal so powerful that it would nullify their control? It was risky. It was dangerous. But it was the only way to stop them. And Elliot knew that if he didn't act, no one else would. He immediately set to work, throwing himself into the project with a feverish intensity. The idea was simple in theory. If he could generate a frequency that resonated with every sound frequency used by the Council, he could nullify it. The Council's transmissions, their manipulations, would be rendered meaningless. Communication would stop, and with it, their ability to control. But creating such a frequency was no small task. The complexity of the project was staggering. Elliot knew the Council's sound manipulation technology was far beyond anything he had ever worked with. Still, he had one advantage they didn't: he understood sound better than anyone. His entire life had been devoted to studying the hidden rhythms of the universe, the way sound and vibration could bend reality itself. And he knew that every frequency, no matter how powerful, had a counterfrequency, a perfect opposite that could cancel it out. For days, Elliot worked tirelessly, his only company the hum of the machines and the distant glow of the city outside. He stayed up for hours on end, pushing his limits, obsessed with the idea of taking down the Council. The only sounds he heard now were his own thoughts, and the rhythm of his heartbeat. He could barely remember the last time he'd spoken to anyone, let alone the last time he'd left the lab. The work was exhausting, but Elliot pushed on. Slowly but surely, the frequency he needed began to take shape. It wasn't just a signal, it was a weapon. A weapon of silence. The very thing that could bring the Council's empire crashing down. He smiled grimly as he realized what he was about to do. But then doubt crept in. What if he was wrong? What if his signal caused something even worse? What if, instead of disrupting the Council's control, he was about to destroy everything? The universe was a delicate balance, and sound was its heartbeat. If he removed sound from the equation, would it collapse? Could he really take that risk? Elliot stood before the console, fingers hovering over the activation button. The silence in the lab was deafening, the weight of the decision pressing on him from every direction. He was just one man, and yet, the fate of the galaxy rested on his shoulders. A voice in his head reminded him that the Council had already made their choice. They had already decided that control was more important than freedom, that power was more important than truth. Elliot wasn't some puppet. He wasn't going to sit idly by while they twisted the very fabric of existence. He was going to act. He had to. With a steady hand, he pressed the button. For a moment, nothing happened. The machines continued their hum, the lights in the lab flickered, but the frequency remained silent. Elliot held his breath. Had he done it wrong? Had he misunderstood everything? And then it came, the first ripple of silence. The air seemed to thicken, the weight of it pressing down on him. The hum of the machines, the distant voices in the corridors, everything disappeared. For the first time in years, the world was quiet. Completely and utterly quiet. Elliot sat back in his chair, eyes wide as he felt the enormity of his action settle over him. The Council's control, their manipulation, their entire system of domination, it was gone. The galaxy, for a brief moment, was free. But as the silence stretched on, Elliot began to feel a creeping unease. He had expected relief, a sense of victory. Instead, he felt a deep, unsettling emptiness. The silence was too much. It wasn't just a lack of sound, it was the absence of everything. No voices, no signals, no thoughts. Just nothing. It was as though the universe itself was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to break the stillness. And then, far off in the distance, he heard a faint crackling sound, a faint whisper of communication trying to break through. He wasn't sure if it was real or just a product of his mind, but it was there. A spark of life in the silence. Elliot had made his choice. He had taken the risk. The galaxy was free, for better or worse. But the question now remained, what would come next in the wake of silence? Would the universe return to its old rhythms, or would it forge a new path, one without the Council, without control, without fear? The silence was deafening. And it was just the beginning. Elliot stood in front of the control panel, his fingers hovering over the buttons. The hum of the lab machines was the only sound, a stark contrast to the gravity of what he was about to do. His mind raced as he stared at the array of data streams in front of him. This was the culmination of days, no weeks, of obsessive work. The frequency he had created, a silent signal that could nullify all others, was ready to be launched. He had considered the consequences 1,000 times over. He had weighed the risks, the potential fallout. The galaxy was balanced precariously on the edge of control, and he was about to tip it. But there was no turning back now. He had made his decision. The Council had to be stopped, and he was the only one who could do it. He pressed a key, and the room fell silent. Not the kind of silence that echoed with the hum of machines or the distant sound of the city outside. No, this was a deep, complete silence. The sound waves themselves had been shattered. It was the absence of everything. For a moment, Elliot sat there, unsure of what would happen next. And then it began. The data streams flickered. His monitors blinked as the signal spread. He could feel it in the air, an energy unlike anything he had ever experienced. The silence wasn't just an absence, it was a force, a disruption that went beyond the physical. It was as though the very fabric of the universe was rippling under the weight of his creation. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. The systems were responding, shutting down, going dark. The Council's frequency manipulation was being countered, disrupted. He had done it. For the first time, their control over the galaxy was slipping. The signal was working. But then came the strange sensation that made Elliot's heart race. The silence began to grow, to expand beyond the confines of his lab. It wasn't just affecting the Council's transmission systems anymore, it was affecting everything. The hum of the air conditioners, the soft beep of the monitoring systems, the distant sounds of the city outside, all of it was fading, becoming indistinct. The silence wasn't just a void, it was a hunger, devouring everything in its path. He leaned forward in his chair, his fingers trembling as he adjusted the controls, trying to gauge the scope of what was happening. The signal was amplifying on its own, expanding out into the galaxy. It was more powerful than he had anticipated. Much more. The Council would never be able to manipulate anything again, but this wasn't just about them anymore. It was affecting everything that relied on sound. His monitors flickered again, and Elliot's eyes widened as the system interface displayed a warning. The signal had become unstable. If it continued to expand unchecked, it could collapse the very foundation of existence itself. No communication, no signals, no life. Everything would grind to a halt. The entire galaxy would go silent. He stood up quickly, panic setting in. His mind raced for a solution. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't realized the true scale of what he had done. The silence wasn't just a tool, it was a force that could unravel the universe. But the more Elliot thought, the more he realized that he couldn't stop it. Not now. Not without undoing everything he had worked for. The Council's influence would never be broken, not if he reversed the signal. There was no way to control the silence once it had started. It was beyond his ability to rein in, to make it fade away. And yet, something inside him refused to believe it was over. There had to be another way. He wasn't going to let it end like this. His fingers flew over the console, adjusting frequencies, tweaking variables. The silence, this perfect, pure silence, had to be stabilized. He couldn't let it tear everything apart, but he couldn't let the Council win either. Not after everything they had done. He had to find a balance, a way to amplify the silence without destroying it. As Elliot worked furiously, his mind grasped at any theory, any solution that might bring him the control he needed. He had spent his life studying sound, its properties, its frequencies, its effects. If silence could stop the Council, surely he could turn it into something else. Something that didn't erase everything. A sudden realization hit him like a jolt of electricity. The signal didn't need to be stopped, it needed to be amplified further. Not in the way he had first envisioned, not as a way to destroy all communication, but as a harmonic frequency that could reset everything. It wouldn't stop the silence, it would make it universal. The silence would restore order by eliminating the corrupting forces that had used sound for their own gain. He quickly adjusted the parameters of the signal, trying to find the resonance he needed. A perfect harmonic, something that would reset the frequencies of the entire galaxy. It would be a blank slate, a new beginning. The Council's manipulation would be gone, and in its place, a new era would emerge. But time was running out. He could feel it. The signal was destabilizing, expanding beyond his control. The silence was growing deeper, more intense, and the systems were beginning to fail. Every second felt like an eternity, and yet Elliot pushed forward, determined to complete his work before it was too late. His heart raced as he found the frequency he was looking for, a resonance that would stabilize the silence without destroying everything. He activated the new parameters, holding his breath as the system processed the new signal. For a moment, nothing happened. The silence continued to stretch, to grow, but there was no change. No catastrophic collapse. And then it began. The signal stabilized. The harmonic frequency settled into place, amplifying the silence without overwhelming it. Elliot's eyes widened as he watched the monitors flicker back to life, displaying a new set of data. The silence was no longer a void, it was now a balance, a cosmic reset. It was the key to breaking the Council's control and ushering in a new form of communication. Without the manipulation of sound, the universe could truly be free. The silence didn't vanish, it became something else. Something new. The galaxy, now silent but not destroyed, was free to rebuild, to form new alliances, to forge new paths without the suffocating weight of the Council's influence. It was a rebirth, not just for the galaxy, but for every species that had ever been subjugated by the manipulation of sound. Elliot collapsed back into his chair, his body trembling with exhaustion. His mind was numb, but the quiet that surrounded him now felt different. It wasn't oppressive, it was peaceful. The silence was no longer a weapon. It was a beginning. And as the last of the Council's transmission systems blinked out of existence, Elliot Drummond knew that the galaxy would never be the same. The Council's influence was gone. The universe was free. But the question remained, what came next? What would happen now that the silence had been heard, and the chains of manipulation had been broken? The answers were unknown, but Elliot knew one thing for sure: whatever came next, it would be humanity's choice. The silence had given them that much. And it was a gift they would never forget. Elliot paced back and forth in his lab, the sharp click of his boots against the cold floor echoing in the silence. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and calculations, each more urgent than the last. The signal was active. It was working. But the silence, it was growing, spreading in ways he hadn't anticipated. He'd known the risks of what he was doing. He'd anticipated the Council's manipulation of sound, the potential for societal collapse. But now, as the very fabric of the universe seemed to warp in the wake of his actions, Elliot found himself questioning everything he thought he knew. It wasn't supposed to be this way. He never meant for the silence to become a force of destruction. He'd wanted to free the galaxy from the Council's control, to stop the manipulation that had enslaved billions for generations. But now, the silence wasn't just the absence of sound, it was an absence of life. It was as though everything, everywhere, had stopped. The universe was holding its breath. The thought shook him. He had to stop it. But he couldn't simply reverse the signal. The silence had already begun to change the very laws of existence. He'd gone too far, and there was no going back. Elliot's fingers hovered over the console as he studied the data. The silence was spreading faster than he had predicted. It was like a virus, a hunger that devoured everything it touched. His lab was the only place that still hummed with life, but even here, the air felt thick, heavy, as though the silence was pushing against him, trying to consume him too. He leaned forward, sweat beading on his forehead. The monitors in front of him displayed chaotic data. The amplification of the silence had reached critical levels. Entire planets, once thriving with the sounds of civilization, were now nothing more than cold, empty spheres drifting in space. The Council's communications had gone dark. Governments, military forces, even the most basic functions of society had ground to a halt. Elliot felt the weight of what he had done press down on him. He hadn't expected the silence to be this absolute, this final. There were no voices now, no transmissions, no signals to track. The entire galaxy was muted. A low buzz interrupted his thoughts. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it was there. It was the first sign of communication, a crack in the oppressive silence. Elliot's heart skipped a beat as he leaned closer to the screen. It wasn't much, just a few flickering data points, but it was enough to spark a glimmer of hope in him. Someone, somewhere, was still alive. Someone was still trying to reach out. He quickly adjusted the settings, filtering through the signal. It was faint, like a whisper, but it was unmistakably a message. Someone was attempting to communicate. Elliot's fingers danced across the console as he enhanced the signal, trying to lock onto it, to amplify it. But every adjustment he made seemed to push the message further away, as though the silence itself was pulling it back into the void. The silence was more than just the absence of sound. It was a force of its own, fighting back against any form of communication. Every effort he made to re-establish a link only seemed to make the silence stronger, more impenetrable. His frustration grew as he realized the extent of the damage. The galaxy was not simply mute, it was disconnected. The delicate web of communication that had held everything together was severed. The silence was a fracture in the very core of existence, and Elliot had been the one to cause it. But then, as if the universe itself was listening to his despair, the faintest of voices crackled through the silence. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. Elliot's pulse quickened as he focused all his attention on the transmission. The voice grew louder, clearer, until it became unmistakable. Elliot! Drummond! You've done it! Elliot's breath caught in his throat. He recognized the voice immediately. It was Zareth, a former ally from his time working with the Council, a high-ranking officer who had always been more sympathetic to Elliot's views than most. She had left the Council years ago, vanishing without a trace. Elliot had assumed she was lost forever. Zareth? Elliot breathed, his voice raw from disuse. Is it really you? Yes. Zareth's voice crackled back. It's me. But you have to stop this. The silence, it's too much. It's not just communication that's gone. The very fabric of life, it's unraveling. The silence is consuming everything. Elliot's mind reeled. He had known the silence would disrupt systems, but he hadn't considered that it might threaten the very existence of the galaxy itself. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a void, a destructive force that was undoing everything it touched. And now, the very life of the universe was at risk. What can we do? Elliot asked, desperation creeping into his voice. I can't stop it. I can't reverse it. You have to amplify it, Zareth said. But not in the way you think. You can't fight the silence, Elliot. It's not a weapon. It's a cleansing force. A reset. Elliot was silent for a long moment. He understood what she was saying, but the idea terrified him. The silence had already broken the galaxy. Amplifying it could mean erasing everything. The Council, the civilizations, the galaxy itself, it could all be gone. But Zareth was right. The silence was already irreversible. And if it was going to cleanse the galaxy, to reset it, then it had to be done correctly. There was no other choice. How? Elliot asked quietly. You have to broadcast the resonance, Zareth replied. The perfect frequency. A harmonic wave that aligns with the silence. If you do it right, it will reset the galaxy. But it will take everything. You won't be able to stop it. Elliot's heart sank. This was it. The end of everything he had known, everything he had fought for. And yet, in that moment, he understood the truth. The Council's control had been a perversion of the universe's natural state. Silence wasn't just a tool to break their manipulation. It was a force to reset the balance of the galaxy. Without another word, Elliot adjusted the console one last time, his fingers shaking as he set the harmonic frequency. He hesitated for only a moment before pressing the activation button. The silence grew deeper, louder, as the resonance spread outward, amplifying the void. The galaxy was silent, and this time, the silence was complete. The transmission faded. The message from Zareth cut off, leaving Elliot alone in the stillness. And as he sat there, the weight of his decision settled in. He knew that the galaxy would never be the same. The silence had consumed everything, but it had also set the stage for a new beginning. What would come next, he couldn't say. But the silence had done its work. The universe had been reset. Elliot sat motionless in his chair, staring at the console as the final pulse of the harmonic frequency spread through the galaxy. His hands were clammy, his chest tight, his breath shallow. The silence that had taken over everything wasn't just the absence of sound anymore, it was the absence of existence. The data streams in front of him were no longer active, no longer transmitting. The universe had gone dark, and all he could hear was the oppressive, suffocating quiet that had enveloped everything. He had done it. But at what cost? The Council's manipulation was over. Their ability to control the galaxy through sound, through frequency, was destroyed. There was no more political subterfuge, no more whispering in the ears of leaders, no more secretive coercion. The silence, the very thing he had created, had wiped it all away. And with it, all that had been left was a void. Elliot felt his mind teeter on the edge of panic. The reality of what he had done was settling in, and it wasn't a victory. It was a terrifying uncertainty. Was this what freedom looked like? A galaxy without communication, without connection? A universe where no one could reach anyone else. He closed his eyes and exhaled sharply, trying to focus. What had been intended as a reset, as a solution, was now an existential crisis. The silence was more than just a cessation of sound. It was a disconnection from everything that had given the universe its rhythm. And then, out of the stillness, a flicker of life. His monitors hummed faintly, just a brief, erratic spark. A signal. Elliot shot to his feet. There it was again, weaker this time, but it was undeniably there. Someone, somewhere, was still trying to reach out, to communicate. His heart beat faster. It wasn't over. There was still hope. He adjusted the controls, amplifying the signal, fighting against the overwhelming wave of silence that threatened to pull him under. The moment he started to tune in, the signal became more distinct, clearer. It wasn't much, but it was a message. It was a lifeline. Elliot! Drummond! The voice crackled through the static, faint but unmistakable. His breath hitched. It was Zareth, the former council officer who had helped him understand the truth behind the council's manipulation. How had she survived the silence? How had she managed to break through the void? Zareth? Elliot's voice came out hoarse, unsure if she could hear him. How are you? How are you reaching me? I've been trying to communicate with you, Elliot. Zareth's voice came through clearer now, growing stronger. The silence, it's not just a tool. It's a cycle. It's pulling us back to the beginning. But it's not over. Elliot swallowed hard. I've done everything I could. I activated the harmonic signal. It's too late for the council. I destroyed their influence. Not destroyed. Reset, Zareth corrected him. But this silence, it's a reset, not an end. The council's control is gone, but the galaxy is fragmented, broken. You've given us a chance to rebuild, but that can't happen if the silence remains. Elliot froze, his fingers brushing against the control panel. What do you mean? It's over. The silence is the reset. Everything has stopped. No, Elliot. You don't understand. Zareth's voice broke through, urgent now. The silence you've created has undone the foundation of the galaxy. Civilizations are scattered. Systems are frozen. Without sound, without communication, nothing can rebuild. The silence has unmade the connections that held everything together. The weight of her words hit him like a hammer. His decision to liberate the galaxy from the council had been right, but it had also left a gaping void. No sound, no signals, no way to reconnect. The galaxy wasn't just stagnant, it was in stasis. It was lifeless. I thought this was the only way, Elliot muttered to himself. I thought silence would set us free. It was supposed to be a cleansing. It was, Zareth agreed softly. But now it's time for the next step. You have to bring back the sound, Elliot. You have to amplify it, restore the frequencies. Bring us back to life. Elliot's chest tightened as he processed her words. He had created the silence, the void. And now, Zareth was asking him to undo what he had done. To bring back everything he had taken. But could he? I can't, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I made the choice. I destroyed everything. I'm the one who let the silence in. No. Zareth's voice was firm. You chose to destroy the council's grip. You chose freedom. But now you need to choose hope. Hope. The words seemed so distant, so abstract in the vastness of the silence. What did hope even look like now? What could it look like in a universe where the simplest forms of communication had been obliterated? But as Elliot listened to Zareth, as the weight of her words settled over him, something in him stirred. The silence was more than just an absence, it was an opportunity. He had taken the first step. Now, the question was whether he could take the next one. Zareth, if I do this, if I bring back the sound, the galaxy will never be the same. It will never return to what it was. The damage is done. And there's no going back. Maybe, Zareth said, But nothing worth doing ever comes without risk. The silence isn't the answer, it's a tool, a foundation. The real work begins now. The real freedom comes when we rebuild. Together. Elliot was silent for a long time. His fingers hovered over the console. The decision was his. He could let the silence continue, an endless void that swallowed everything, or he could try to bring balance back. But to do so would mean undoing the very thing he had fought for, giving sound, giving life, another chance. What do I need to do? Elliot asked, finally finding the words. Tell me what to do. Zaratha's voice softened, almost reassuring. You have to sync the frequencies, Elliot. Use the harmonic resonance you created. Not just to amplify the silence, but to return the rhythm of the galaxy. You've broken the Council's chains, but now you have to set the beat for everything else to follow. You can't let the silence rule. Let it settle, but then use it as a foundation. Elliot nodded, his mind working in overdrive as he adjusted the parameters of the console. The harmonic frequency he had created, the one that had severed the Council's influence, was still present. But now, he needed to change it. He needed to return the rhythm. Slowly, carefully, he began to amplify it, making the changes necessary for the universe to respond. A strange hum filled the room, faint but growing in intensity. The silence started to shift, vibrating, as if life itself was stirring again. The frequencies were moving, reconnecting, rebuilding. Slowly but surely, the signal began to restore the connections the silence had erased. It wasn't an instant fix. The silence hadn't vanished entirely, but now it was more of a presence than a void. It had become a base, a foundation on which the universe could rebuild, realign, and regenerate. Elliot closed his eyes, letting the hum fill him. The galaxy had been reset, but now it was being reborn. The silence, while still present, would no longer be a force of destruction. It would become part of the natural cycle of communication of life. The universe had been remade, by his hands. And now, it was ready to move forward. Zaratha's voice broke through again, softer now, with an air of cautious optimism. You've done it, Elliot. You've given us a chance. For the first time since the silence had started, Elliot allowed himself a small, hopeful smile. The galaxy had been silenced. But now, it was ready to speak again,